It is May the 10th, 1940. Hey guys, I'm Gaslight Studios. And on this date, Germany launches its long awaited offensive in the West. The phony war had been going on for about 7 months in the West. There had been minor actions in Norway. The German Navy was in the process of a vicious war in the upper Baltic in not the upper Baltics in the North Sea with the Royal Navy. Germany's mountain troops were deployed up there as well. So the Germans, it wasn't really a phony war. It was more of okay, smash, smash, smash. So it had been going on for 7 to 8 months now. The phony war in the West, that is. There had been really no major combat along the Franco-German border. That was about to change. May the 10th begins with a short artillery barrage, and the Germans sweep in through Holland and Belgium. The German Fallschirmjäger quickly take the Belgian fortress of Ebenemal, silencing its guns and forcing their way into southern Belgium. By May the 14th, the Dutch army, heavily outnumbered, outmatched, outgunned, and frankly behind the times, is forced to surrender after the bombing of Rotterdam the previous day. The Allied forces, the BEF and two French armies, move up to the River Dyle in Belgium. They hope to establish a couple of defensive belts and blunt any German offensive as they would have done, as their fathers and older brothers would have done in the First World War. However, technology has changed, and the Germans have decided to do something radically different. People have been wondering about, like, why the hell did they decide to do this ever since, and people have been admiring this move ever since. The move into the Ardennes. Most of the German panzer divisions have been concentrated in the Ardennes from Army Group B. I believe, it's Army Group B. The German Army is divided into three groups: A in the north, B facing the Ardennes, and C under Ritter von Bock is going to be deployed at the southernmost end facing the Maginot Line. Von Rundstedt has the center, and Ewald von Kleist has the northern flank. So it's a continuous front. The German Panzer Corps under Heinz Guderian now races forward through the Ardennes at basically a breakneck pace, which is impressive considering the Ardennes is not exactly conducive to tank operations. There are very few open spots in the Ardennes that you can actually maneuver tanks in. And the Germans go through those woods. They arrive at the town of Sedan a couple of hours, about a day later, I want to say. Within 4 days, they have taken Sedan, but not without heavy fighting, which delays their advance by a few, days. Unfortunately, the Allies make little use of their advantage, still convinced that the majority of the Germans will be coming through Holland and Belgium. Holland surrender on May the 14th, the same day that the Germans finally takes in only guarantees that to them that the majority of the German army is concentrating against them in the Low Countries, rather than to their south in the Low Countries. The Germans, under Guderian, move forward slowly at first, and then burst out into the upper Somme Valley. They take a couple of British divisions by surprise, but near the town of Arras, a pair of British regiments and a few, I want to say about 70 to 80 tanks blunt the German advance, and certainly give the German High Command a hell of a scare. Their tanks, the Panzers 1, 2, and 3, as well as the Czech M38Ts, really are not suited for going up against the British heavy tanks, even though the British heavy tanks are damn near useless. They're way too heavy, way too slow. They've got really good guns and really good armor, but nothing really beyond that. The Matilda, in particular, is absurdly slow. When the German army, Guderian, on May the 19th, reaches the town of Amiens. Incidentally, that's near where the Red Baron was shot down some 22 years prior. So we have the British in the north, the British and French armies in the north, the Maginot Line in the south, the German army sweeping in between. May the 19th, they take Amiens. By 9 p.m., they've taken Abbeville. At midnight, a reconnaissance battalion has taken the town of Noyelles-sur-Mer on the very coast and at the mouth of the Somme estuary. The Germans now decide to move north. Well, they don't decide. This was part of the plan. They've now trapped the Allies, and they will move forward. A couple of tank engagements are held. I believe it's Colonel at this point. Yeah, Colonel Charles de Gaulle leads a couple of French tank regiments up and attempt to break the pincer. But the Germans blow these off with relative ease. The French don't use the tanks the way the Germans do. They tend to fritter them away in the same way that they had done in the First World War, because they think that tanks should support the infantry, not the other way around. But this is 20 years later, so it's technology and tactics have completely changed. The Germans now... The French by now are just a busted flesh. On May the... I want to say it's the 13th. May the 13th or 14th, Churchill actually flies down to Paris, and Sedan's fall has really shaken the French High Command. He goes to Paris and demands to know where are the strategic reserves to the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud. And Reynaud says, there aren't any. They no longer exist. I forget if it was Reynaud or Gamelin, but anyways, he talks to the French High Command, and they say, we don't have any troops left. We can't combat this advance. Which, to be fair here, was probably the only sane thing to say. The Germans at this point seemed unstoppable. De Gaulle's attack had failed, Arras had failed to throw the Germans off, and they were advancing like mad through both the Low Countries and drawing the net ever tighter against the Allies. But not everything went according to plan. The Germans were pinned down by 40,000 French troops in a very, very hard-line and brilliant defensive action at the town of Lille, which would only end a few days after the famous evacuation from Dunkirk. The Germans then force their way north. Guderian pushes his way northward. Ewald von Kleist pushes his way west. And they shove through British regiments and divisions. On May the 28th, 18 days after the offensive began, Belgium quits. They really have nothing left to fight with. Well, 400,000 men, but their country's effectively been abandoned. The troops are heavily demoralized. They don't really want to fight anymore, and so Leopold of Belgium simply calls it quits. This opens a massive gap in the Allied front line. The Belgians had been assigned to hold the northernmost end of the line, and now this basically leaves the British Expeditionary Forces' northern flank wide open for the Germans to simply walk in. When the Germans do in fact walk in, the British have already pulled back to a new defensive belt, but it is not Oh, there's the Luftwaffe. So the Germans then rush. They rush. Um, the Germans, as I was saying, they rush forward and attempt to close the net. They take a couple of fortresses en route. They take Bologna. They take Calais. Um, Again, heavy resistance at both places. The British at Calais only surrender when they are basically out of ammunition. Dunkirk is a slightly different story, but I won't get into the technical details of the evacuation. I'm not an expert on the evacuation, and I'm talking about the Battle of France in very generic terms. Dunkirk, or Dunkirk, as the Dutch call it, Dune Church, which is what it translates to roughly from the Flemish and from the French. Well, I mean, Dunkirk is the translation into the French from Dunkirk, which is the Dutch, which literally just means Dune Church. It's built in this very sandy area of Flanders. So the Germans um, uh, basically attempt to drive the British out of Dunkirk, the British and the French. For every British soldier there, I believe there were 4 or 5 Frenchmen. So that tells you something about how desperate the situation was. The French held on as long as they could. So did the British. The French, I think, had to deployed an entire division, where the Brits could only deploy a company. They couldn't afford to put their strength like that. It was, by any stretch of the imagination, a disaster. Hitler issued the halt order, the infamous halt order. A few days had issued the infamous halt order. I forget what the day is, but I'm pretty sure it was like May 25th or something like that, or thereabouts. But when the SS commander Josef Sepp Dietrich requested permission to take the Leibstrandater regiment and push it, he was part of Army Group A, so he wanted to slash his way into Dunkirk. Hitler acquiesced to Guderian's demand. Guderian enabled von Kleist and von Rundstedt's request that they be allowed to push in and take the. Well, actually, von Rundstedt had requested the halt because he was almost out of fuel, but then Guderian said, "Let's go, let's go." Von Rundstedt reluctantly acquiesced, told Hitler, "Can we go in?" "Yes, you can, because my SS boys are in there now." So when the SS actually goes in, it's not that they cross the Scheldt-Eskau Canal, and they basically get shot up. They get shot up very badly in an ambush, and Dietrich's almost captured. So the Germans, far from actually closing the net, the British just blaze out. Actually, there's one rather interesting story from this that I just would love to mention. The British. There's an awesome story about 3 Highlanders from a Scottish regiment or division. Anyways, they had gone to the German. They had actually gotten. I think they had gotten isolated from their unit, and a German officer found them, and he says, "Who are you? Where are you from?" They were in civilian clothes, so he obviously had no idea who they were. And after speaking to them in every language he knew, the Scots blatantly refused to understand, and one of them just started blabbering in Gaelic. The German officer produced a map, basically, "Where are you from?" in whatever language he decided to use. And sorry, this is hilarious. The Highlander pointed his finger directly at Russia. Isn't that great? So the German officer then let them go, and they managed to make it to Spain and then to Portugal, which was pretty funny. Germany and the Soviet Union were at the moment in a non-aggression pact and had agreed to divvy up the Baltics and Poland, as well as bits of Eastern Europe between each other, of course. That will change on June 22nd, 1941, but that's entirely outside the sphere of this series. So the Germans, they get run over. Well, and the Germans, they don't get run over, but they have run over everything in their path, and the French and British are holding on to their fingernails at Dunkirk. And of course, this is the infamous moment where Goering convinces Hitler to unleash the Luftwaffe against the British. And this, well, it doesn't necessarily go according to plan. It certainly isn't that bad. I mean, the Luftwaffe was pinned, was had, well, they had a fair share of the what we'll call the glory of the operation, but the army was worn out. The SS, as I said, had been badly shot up in a couple of ambushes. The panzers were almost out of petrol, and their crews were exhausted, even though they were on speed more than one way. It was not a good situation for the average German infantryman, and the average tank crew, and the average SS guy, and the average artilleryman. And so the Luftwaffe is called upon to blow the crap out of the out of Dunkirk. The RAF keeps the Germans pretty much occupied outside of Dunkirk, and the French and the British push where they hold the bag, if you will, of Dunkirk. They hold it as far away as they can, so that the German artillery can't hit the men being evacuated over the two moles. Or I'm sure if anyone's seen the film Dunkirk, they'll know what a mole is. It's just that basically cement block that's shoved that is jutted out into the sea, and usually it's used for fishermen. I believe, yeah, it was primarily used for smaller fishermen or large fishermen ships. The British tended to use destroyers to evacuate their men, as did the French. They were all using destroyers. So this was not really this was not a great situation. H.M. Dowding wrote a few days into the German offensive that what was the exact quote? If the home defense is frittered away in attempting to retrieve the situation in France, then defeat in France will involve the inevitable and irreparable defeat of this country. And so the RAF was put on hold, not while the evacuation was underway, but after the evacuation, they decided we're not going to send any more planes over there. The French have a lot of planes, they have a lot of troops. Their morale may be shattered, but we have to preserve what's left of our army, or not of our just our armed forces, the air and land components. The British had to abandon most of their stuff at Dunkirk: trucks, artillery, black cannons, etc., hordes of rifles and tanks. There are some instances of British troops literally when they returned 4 years later in D-Day, they come up against some rather shoddy static divisions who've been recruited from occupied territories, or Soviet prison camps or whatever, people who have been corralled into serving into Heer, not the Deutsches Heer, that's First World War. But they'll find whole regiments outfitted with SMLE rifles, which is, I think, an amusing touch. Maybe not a nice touch, but it's certainly It's certainly an interesting story. But by the beginning of June, the British have, by the midpoint of June, the British have already abandoned. The British and a large portion of the French army have already gotten away to. They've already gotten away to Britain, and so it is not. It just isn't a. It wasn't a good time, and Winston Churchill, though he always speculated about a Nazi invasion, knew it probably wouldn't succeed. But in early July, Hitler visited Paris, much to the humiliation and chagrin of the French, much to the irritants of the French populace, and certainly of Charles de Gaulle, who was in London at the time, and he was certainly not happy. And he set himself up as basically the head of the Free French forces. There was no one else there. Philippe Pétain had already signed the armistice and was now head of state for the basically the Nazi puppet state in southern France. And de Gaulle makes his famous speech from London, and I shall have that up presently.
La défaite française a été causée par la force mécanique, aérienne et terrestre de l'ennemi. L'action foudroyante de cette force mécanique a amené l'effondrement du moral, du commandement et du gouvernement. Devant cet effondrement, deux voies s'ouvrent de l'abandon et du désespoir. Elle menait à la capitulation. C'est celle qu'a choisie le gouvernement Pétain. L'autre est celle de l'honneur et de l'espérance. C'est celle que nous avons prise, mes compagnons et moi. Nous croyons que l'honneur des Français consiste à continuer la guerre aux côtés de leurs alliés, et nous sommes résolus à le faire. Nous espérons qu'un jour, une force mécanique supérieure nous permettra d'avoir la victoire et de délivrer la patrie.
Before I go, I should just mention that I have a special shout out for a friend. His name is Matt Valier. He runs the channel Zog Pertinix. I'll put the link in the description. But he also runs the. He is also running a Commonwealth War Graves Foundation charity march, which will take place in 10 days. They are short $1,850, so if any of you has $1,850.11, please send it over to them, or over to him. Till then, I bid you all adieu, and in the next video, we shall be visiting the 18th century. God bless you guys.